Hello and welcome to this session of the course Introduction to Autonomous Systems. You would have probably gone through the last lecture in which we introduced the idea of human intelligence. We also looked at some of the aspects of human intelligence and finally came to the broad conclusion that there is not a single representation of intelligence that we can consider to be the applicable, and that we have to depend on multiple intelligence theory. Now, the fact that our system, which is essentially trying to make machines intelligent, we need to also consider how that multiple intelligence or how the human intelligence is connected to the idea of machine intelligence or artificial intelligence. So, let us begin today's lecture. Now, if we look at the field of artificial intelligence, we find that it not only attempts to understand how we think, but also to design machines that can think like us. That is the fundamental premise with which we are looking at what we call the machine intelligence or intelligent machines. In fact, the work on this topic started immediately after Second World War. Of course, at that time it was not known by the term artificial or machine intelligence, because this term was coined sometime in 1956. Artificial intelligence or AI, which is what we are using for short nowadays, encompasses many subdisciplines such as learning, perception, proving theorems, playing chess, writing poems, driving cars, and a whole lot of activities where machines kind of do things that we humans are used to doing. In some interpretations, AI is also described as intelligence of artifacts, whatever they may be. We will need to define them, what is that artifact is, but generally this is how it also is described. Of course, in all its manifestations, the artificial intelligence discipline draws heavily from our understanding of human intelligence, because ultimately we are trying to create machines that can think like us. So, obviously, unless we understand how our intelligence can get represented, we will find it difficult to translate the same thing into a machine. In fact, we realize that by analyzing various aspects of human intelligence, we get a fair idea of what needs to be done in order to create machines that can think or are intelligent. So, let us look at artificial intelligence domain itself. Similar to the human intelligence scenario, where we found that there were multiple manners in which the intelligence could be described for humans, the same multitude of definition also exists for artificial intelligence itself, and we also need to look at all of these in order to capture the essence of the artificial intelligence that we will need to then incorporate in the machines that can think like us. Of course, researchers have over a period of time included machine intelligence, also as part of the overall definition of artificial intelligence, though some of these are general enough to include even human or animal intelligence. So, let us start by looking at some of the definitions of the artificial intelligence that people have come up with over a period of time. One of the commonly employed definitions of AI is system that perceives its environment and takes action to maximize its chance of success. So, you can see that we are looking at a system that is going to be aware of its environment and take action which will give the best possible result in a given context. And you will realize that is precisely what as humans we are doing most of the time, that we are always aware of what is around us and our actions are essentially to create the best possible solutions or outcomes. Of course, there is another accepted definition is system's ability to correctly interpret external data, to learn from such data and to use those learnings to achieve specific goals through flexible adaptation. Now, if you look at this definition, it is almost like a description, because it is now opening up the general definition that we saw in the previous statement, where we are now being little bit more specific about what tasks that will be required to be performed, like interpretation of external data, learning from such data and employing these learnings to achieve specific goals like goal management and adaptation, which means self correction. So, all those 5 attributes of autonomy that we saw earlier now are being represented through this definition of the artificial intelligence. So, essentially we now see that artificial intelligence in some way is related to our requirement of providing autonomy to a system. If we look at mathematicians, how they have defined AI, obviously it is a little different, and just to put in place the definition that they have used, we look at this statement that capacity for efficient cross domain optimization. So, which means it is looking at a multidisciplinary or multi domain optimization according to its preferences, which means there are certain preferred objectives, or there is another way in which mathematicians define when they say capability to steer the future into regions of high possibility, which means we are looking at the outcomes of our actions in future which are desirable, and that the probability of such outcomes being there is very high. Let us now come to the functionalities that are part of the basic artificial intelligence. So, in view of these definitions that we have seen, it is possible to categorize artificial intelligence into 2 functions that are to be carried out in order to achieve artificial or machine intelligence. The first functionality refers to the thought process, because if you remember, right in the beginning we have said that we are talking about machines that can think like us. So, now there is a functionality of thought that has to be part of any artificial intelligence system. So, the first functionality refers to the thought process, and the way it is expressed is thinking humanly or rationally. We will come to these in little more detail and understand what exactly they mean, but at this point let us just treat them as placeholders, that this is a function that an AI system will need to perform, that is thinking like a human or thinking rationally. While the second one refers to the action, like acting humanly or rationally, which means taking actions which probably would appear to have been taken by a human or acting in a rational manner. We will look at these two ideas little more detail later. So, if we were to define what we mean by thinking humanly, what we are saying is that the thought processes that ultimately we will implement in these machines, along with the reasoning skills, they have the fidelity to the level of human performance. What it means is that if suppose you took out that AI system and placed a human there, then to what level of fidelity a human would be able to think and reason out a particular decision is what we mean by thinking humanly. And this may be one of the requirements that we may need to implement in the artificial system. On the other hand, when we say thinking rationally, what we are essentially saying is that this fidelity is with respect to an ideal that we have decided, and immediately you realize that there is now going to be a small difference. Thinking rationally means by and large giving a correct interpretation to a given situation, whereas when we talk about thinking humanly, there could be additional factors that may come and impact the actual thought process and the reasoning for taking the decision. So, while rationality talks about an ideal, the humanly part talks about practical aspects, that what is practically achievable. Similarly, when we talk about acting humanly, it relates to the fidelity of the behavior of humans or the machine which is likely to behave like us to the level of human performance, which means the behavior is consistent with how a human would behave, while when we talk about rationally, again we talk about fidelity with respect to an ideal. So, now we have these 4 placeholders that when we talk about acting, we are looking at one, an ideal performance, other one, a realistic or a practical performance, and when we are thinking, then there is one ideal performance or ideal thought and another one which is a realistic or a practical thought. Now, we will realize that we will need to kind of flip between these 4 ideas in order to look at our development of AI systems. So, let us look at human versus rational approach. When we talk about human approach to AI, which means if you are looking at a system which will think humanly and act humanly, what we are essentially saying is that these now involve empirical results based on observations of humans, human behavior, society, societal systems, and also includes some hypothesis about human behavior in the overall context. So, we are essentially looking at how a human would act, a normal human being in a given scenario. Of course, on the other hand, when we talk about rational approach, we are talking about more quantitative assessment of the decision making process and the actions, and you will immediately realize that this would then need use of mathematics and engineering for modeling the thought and behavior, which means we now will need more definitive models, in our opinion, let us say more accurate models or more representative models, which can then be mathematically calculated, estimated, so that we can model the thought and behavior in the form of an ideal that we have in mind. Of course, this is probably intuitive to realize that both of these approaches contribute to the efforts for creating an artificial intelligence based system. So, to conclude this initial introduction to the artificial intelligence scenario, we find that AI or artificial intelligence is essentially a mapping of human intelligence in a mathematical form in order to make it a computational strategy which can be deployed by a machine. And at this point, whether you are acting humanly or whether you are acting rationally, in both the cases we will require a mathematical form. In the first case, when we are talking about fidelity of a human behavior, we are looking at empirical models, thumb rules, whereas when we are talking about acting or behaving rationally, we are looking at lot more definitive mathematical models which are based on laws of physics and any other laws that may be applicable in a given context. So, with that we come to the end of the present session. We will continue to discuss this matter further in the next lecture. So, bye and hope to see you in the next lecture. Thank you.